Imagine kneeling in the dim light of a forgotten plantation, your hammer splitting ancient boards, only to reveal a hidden world below, where a man's desperate pleas to God echo from yellowed pages, stained with the blood of unforgiven sins. What if the ground beneath your feet held not just secrets, but a judgment waiting to rise? In the sweltering haze of Tensaw Parish, Louisiana, where the Mississippi River coils like a serpent through the flat, unforgiving delta, the year 1887 dawned with the promise of renewal, or so the renovation crew believed. The air hung heavy with the scent of decaying magnolias and brackish bayou water, a land perpetually teetering on the edge of submersion, as if the earth itself yearned to swallow its own history. Hargrave Hall, once a beacon of antebellum opulence, now stood as a skeletal relic, its white cypress facade peeling like sunburnt skin, its deep verandas sagging under the weight of neglect. Vines of kudzu clawed at the columns, twisting like the fingers of the damned, reaching for something long buried. The house whispered to those who listened, subtle groans in the wind, shadows that lingered too long in the corners, but few ever heeded its call. Gerald Fontaine, a master carpenter from the bustling streets of New Orleans, led the team. At 42, he was a man forged in the fires of precision and patience, his hands calloused from years of coaxing life back into dying structures. His journal, bound in worn leather and filled with sketches of joists and beams, served as his confessor, a silent witness to the mundane miracles of restoration. That spring morning, as the sun pierced the canopy of live oaks draped in Spanish moss like veils mourning the lost South, Fontaine and his 6 workers arrived with tools slung over shoulders, boots crunching on gravel paths overgrown with thistles. The distant croak of frogs from the bayou provided a rhythmic underscore, a natural metronome to their labor, while the humid air clung to their skin like a second layer of guilt. Alton Price, the distant heir from Memphis, had inherited this crumbling estate from his reclusive cousin, Julian Hargrave, the last of the line. Price, a merchant more at home amid cotton bales and ledger books than in the haunted hush of rural Louisiana, saw only potential profit in the decay. Make it sellable, he'd wired tersely, his words echoing the impersonal greed that had built such places. Fontaine's mandate was clear: strip away the rot, reinforce the bones, and banish the ghosts of disrepair. They started in the grand parlor, where sunlight filtered through cracked shutters and golden shafts, illuminating dust motes that danced like restless spirits. The floorboards, warped by decades of floods and forgotten tears, creaked underfoot with every step, as if protesting the intrusion. As hammers swung and pry bars bit into wood, the air grew thick with the aroma of aged pine and something sharper, a metallic tang, almost medicinal, that prickled the nostrils and stirred unease. Fontaine noted it in his journal: odor peculiar, not mere mildew. Hints of preservation, or perhaps concealment. The men worked in rhythm, their banter light at first, stories of wives and whiskey, of the river's fickle moods, but as boards lifted, revealing the crawl space below, the conversation faltered. What they expected was emptiness, perhaps a nest of rats, or the skeletal remains of some long-dead possum. Instead, their lanterns cast flickering light on a revelation that froze them in place. Beneath the parlor's floor lay another floor, intact, ancient, its planks hewn from virgin cypress, darkened by time but unyielding. It spanned the entire footprint of the house, a secret stratum sealed away, the space between no more than 18 inches high, a claustrophobic void pregnant with history. The air escaping from it was stale, tomb-like, carrying whispers of isolation and despair. Scattered within were artifacts of a life interrupted: a rusted tin mug, its handle bent as if from frantic grips, frayed ropes, fibers unraveling like unraveling sanity, a bone comb, teeth missing like gaps in a forbidden tale, and strips of homespun cloth, faded to the color of ash, evoking shrouds for the unrestful dead. But it was the small ledger that commanded their gaze, a modest volume. No larger than a prayer book, its leather cover cracked like parched earth, pages brittle as autumn leaves. Tuscan, Fontaine's most trusted hand, a wiry Creole with eyes sharp as chisel points, lifted it gingerly, the lamplight revealing faint inscriptions. The handwriting was deliberate, each letter etched with the painstaking effort of the self-taught, a testament to defiance in an era that criminalized literacy for the enslaved. Fontaine took it, his fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of intrusion into something sacred, something that screamed of divine reckoning. That evening, in the dim glow of a kerosene lamp at the St. Joseph boarding house, where the walls echoed with the laughter of travelers and the distant hum of river traffic, Fontaine opened the journal. The Mississippi lapped at the levees outside, a constant reminder of the land's impermanence, as if the waters themselves conspired to wash away sins. The first entry, undated but laced with the urgency of the mid-1850s, read, "I scribe these words in shadow, for light is forbidden me now. My name is Caleb, bound to Harlan Hargrave, and for 4 years I have dwelled in this underworld, unseen by man but beheld by God. If you find this, know that justice slumbers not eternally." Fontaine's breath caught, he copied the words verbatim, his own hand steadier but his mind reeling. Was this forgery? A cruel jest? Or the echo of a soul crying out for redemption? To grasp the profundity of this discovery, one must journey back to the roots of Hargrave Hall, entwined with the thorny vines of America's original sin. Tensaw Parish, post-Civil War, was a limbo realm, neither the grandeur of the Old South nor the uncertain dawn of Reconstruction. The land stretched endless, a tapestry of cotton fields scarred by neglect, where humidity wrapped around you like a shroud, and the bayous murmured secrets to the willows. Mosquitoes hummed psalms of pestilence, and the sunsets bled crimson over the horizon, evoking the spilled blood that fertilized the soil. The Hargraves arrived in 1812, armed with a land grant and an insatiable hunger for dominion, the kind that Scripture warns against, the pride that goeth before destruction. Harlan Hargrave, the patriarch, was a colossus of pragmatism, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes like polished flint, unyielding in his pursuit of wealth. He transformed 1,500 acres into a cotton empire, his overseers cracking whips like thunderbolts from a wrathful deity. The enslaved, over 100 souls, labored under a regime of biblical brutality, their quarters a row of hovels huddled like penitents at the edge of the fields. Harlan's wife, Clarissa, from Natchez, was a ghost in her own home, her daguerreotype captured a gaze averted, lips pressed in silent supplication, as if pleading with heaven for mercy. They bore 2 sons, Julian, the heir apparent, spirited and ill-suited for the yoke of management, and Elias, claimed by fever at age 6, a loss that hardened Harlan's heart like Pharaoh's. The plantation's underbelly, the raised basement Harlan claimed for storage, was a cavern of shadows, lit by sputtering candles, shelves groaning with bales of cotton samples, barrels of molasses, and hams curing in salt. But whispers among the quarters spoke of more, a place where disobedience met divine-like judgment, where the Master's justice mirrored the Old Testament's eye for an eye. Harlan, a nominal Baptist, twisted Scripture to sanctify his rule, preaching sermons on obedience from the veranda while ignoring the cries below. It was here, in this subterranean sanctum, that the seeds of concealment were sown. The war ravaged the Hargraves like a plague from Exodus. Harlan perished in 1862, not in glory but slumped over his desk, quill in hand, as if struck down by an avenging angel mid-sentence. Julian, then 26, inherited a crumbling kingdom, fields fallow, debts mounting, the air thick with the defeat's bitter ash. Emancipation came like manna, but Julian, unlike his father's iron fist, showed glimmers of grace. He shifted to sharecropping, contracts deemed equitable by the Freedmen's Bureau, acts of tentative redemption in a land steeped in iniquity. Yet, why had Harlan sealed the original floor? Why entomb a space that pulsed with unspoken atrocities? Julian's silence suggested complicity, a burden carried like Cain's mark, withdrawing him into eccentricity, his conversations trailing into voids, eyes haunted by visions of judgment. By 1878, Julian died alone, his body found in the parlor, face pressed to the false floor as if listening for echoes from below. The estate passed to Price, who viewed it once in 1880, shuddering at its aura, a miasma of unresolved sin, rumors swirling like fog over the bayou. Locals spoke in hushed tones of Hargrave Hall's curse, not of ghosts, but of a spiritual debt unpaid, a legacy of bondage that tainted the soil. Price's failed sales attempts only deepened the mystery, until Fontaine's crew arrived, unwitting archaeologists of the soul. As work progressed, the hidden floor yielded more relics, a child's wooden toy, whittled roughly, symbolizing innocence crushed, iron shackles, rusted but intact, chains that bound body and spirit, and faded Bible pages, torn from Genesis, verses on slavery underlined in faded ink, Harlan's twisted theology. Each item evoked a spiritual chill, as if the artifacts were talismans of divine retribution, reminders that vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Fontaine, a devout Catholic, felt the pull of something ethereal. In his journal, he pondered, is this mere history, or a call to unearth buried wrongs? The air between floors feels charged, like the hush before thunder, God's whisper urging confession. He confided in Tuscan over tin cups of chicory coffee, the night insects chorusing outside like a requiem. This ain't just wood and nails, Tuscan murmured. Crossing himself. It's a tomb for souls unabsolved. Seeking counsel, Fontaine approached Sheriff Duval in St. Joseph, a portly man with a mustache like broom bristles, his office smelling of tobacco and stale justice. Duval listened, brow furrowed, then leaned back. Old bones, Fontaine. What stirs you to dig 'em up? The war's over, let the dead rest. But Fontaine pressed, the journal's weight in his pocket like a stone tablet. Duval's dismissal rang hollow, laced with fear. Perhaps ties to old families lingered, descendants shielding legacies from the light. Undeterred, Fontaine delved deeper into Caleb's writings. The journal was a mosaic of anguish, fragments scrawled in stolen moments, ink improvised from soot and berry juice, pages illuminated by slivers of light-piercing floor cracks. Caleb, enslaved since boyhood, had arrived at Hargrave in 1841, his back scarred from prior masters, his spirit unbroken. He learned letters in secrecy, risking lashes for the power of words, an act of rebellion echoing Moses' defiance. By 1850, trusted in the house, he overheard whispers of Harlan's cruelties, punishments meted in the basement, where screams mingled with river murmurs, bodies broken in the name of order. Then, the pivotal event alluded to in veiled terms, a night of fire and fury, where Caleb witnessed an atrocity that shattered his world. Perhaps a killing, or worse, a sin against kin, cloaked in shadows. Rather than flee, Caleb chose the abyss below, vanishing into the floor's embrace. Why? In a poignant entry, to run is to chase the horizon, but here, beneath their feet, I become the thorn in their soul, the voice in their dreams. God sees all, from this grave, I await his hammer. It was a profound act of spiritual warfare, turning captivity into vigil, his presence a haunting reminder of unrepented evil. Fontaine's nights grew sleepless, the journal's words invading his dreams, visions of Caleb huddled in darkness, rationing crumbs slipped through cracks. By sympathetic souls, his prayers ascending like incense. The chemical scent? Embalming fluids, perhaps, or preservatives Harlan used to hide evidence, bodies, secrets, sins preserved for Judgment Day. As the crew exposed more, tensions mounted. Whispers among workers, this place is cursed, the Lord's anger lingers. One man, Elias, swore he heard scratching below rats, or restless spirits. Fontaine, grappling with faith, saw symbols everywhere, the false floor as humanity's facade, hiding the rot of sin, the journal as a prophet's scroll, demanding reckoning. In Tensaw, word spread like wildfire through cotton, old-timers recalling Hargrave whispers, disappearances unexplained, fields yielding poor despite fertile soil, as if blighted by biblical famine. Descendants of freedmen shared oral tales, the master built over hell itself, trapping cries that echo still. Fontaine resolved to uncover all, but Duval's deputies arrived, eyes stern, cease digging, this is history, not spectacle. Yet, the pull was irresistible, a spiritual imperative to expose, to redeem. As rain lashed the roof, thunder rumbling like divine proclamation, Fontaine pondered, what if this discovery was providence, a chance to atone for a nation's wounds? The story deepened, layers peeling like onion skins, each revealing sharper dread. Caleb's entries grew frantic, descriptions of overheard conversations, Julian's growing guilt, the house's groans as omens. The floor above creaks with their steps, he wrote, each one a judgment upon their souls. I am the witness God left behind. In this cinematic tapestry, Hargrave Hall transcended brick and mortar, it was a parable of redemption deferred, sins buried but not forgotten. The air hummed with potential revelation, the bayou's mists veiling truths yet to surface. What horrors lay sealed? What divine justice awaited unleashing? The workers, unwitting apostles, stood on the precipice, hearts pounding with empathy for Caleb's plight, dread for the legacy unearthed, curiosity burning like altar fire. As Fontaine closed the journal that fateful night, lightning illuminated the room, casting shadows that danced like accusing fingers. The path ahead promised immersion in a tale of guilt's long shadow, where every creak evoked reflection on humanity's capacity for evil and grace. The Journal of Caleb, once called Kato in the hurried script of a man who feared even his own handwriting, did not confess easily. It guarded its secrets the way a wounded animal guards its final breath. Each entry arrived in fragments, written in stolen slivers of time when moonlight slipped through the narrow vents or when the house above slept under the weight of its own sins. The pages, brittle as old communion wafers, carried the faint scent of damp earth and desperation when Gerald Fontaine first turned them in the flickering light of his boarding house lamp. Caleb's words began with the question he knew every future reader would ask: "Why did you stay?" "I know the thought burning in your mind," he wrote. "Why not run? Why not slip into the night, follow the North Star until the chains fell away? I considered it. Night after night I weighed the river against the risk, the swamp against the whip. But there is something here heavier than iron. Something that, if I abandon it, will vanish forever into the Master's silence. I am the sole keeper of its location. If I go, the truth perishes with me. So I remain. I endure. I listen. And I write, hoping that one day these words will find eyes that still believe in justice." What was this something he could not abandon? The journal refused to name it outright in the early pages. Instead, it painted the architecture of his survival with chilling precision, turning claustrophobia into a kind of sacred vigil. A narrow gap in the foundation brickwork, barely wider than a man's shoulders, allowed the faintest thread of air to enter from beneath the house. Caleb had widened it over months before his disappearance, chiseling in darkness with a stolen nail, testing each scrape against the rhythm of footsteps overhead. Water came from a lead pipe that fed the kitchen cistern. He had pierced it with painstaking care, creating a drip no larger than a tear that he caught in the hollow of a broken gourd. Food arrived sporadically. Always after midnight, always through a method he described only as the kindness of one who risks more than I. He would never reveal the helper's name, not even in these private pages. Protection, he called it. A final mercy in a world that offered none. By the time the first dated entry appeared, summer 1852, Caleb had lived beneath the floors for more than 14 months. In that time he had mapped the house above as intimately as a cartographer maps a battlefield. Every creak became a landmark. The slow groan of the central staircase announced the housekeeper's dawn patrol. Hargrave Sr.'s heavy boots crossed the study floor at precisely 4:17 each afternoon, followed by the sharp click of a window latch and the bloom of pipe tobacco drifting downward like incense offered to a false god. Clarissa Hargrave's rocking chair on the upper gallery swayed in measured arcs until exactly 9:42 p.m., then stopped as though she, too, listened for something stirring below. Julian, called June, the eldest son, moved lightest of all, soft steps that hesitated at doorways, as if he feared crossing thresholds into rooms that still echoed his father's commands. These details were not mere observation. They were evidence of endurance raised to the level of sacrament. Caleb had transformed captivity into surveillance, turning the Master's house into his own confessional booth. From below he heard prayers that never reached heaven, arguments that ended in slammed doors, the muffled sobs of a wife who had long since stopped asking questions. He catalogued them the way a priest might catalogue sins, methodically, without mercy, knowing that someday the ledger would be opened. The journal grew darker as the entries progressed. The tone shifted from stoic resolve to something closer to prophetic fury. Caleb began to circle the event that had driven him underground, the spring of 1851. He never wrote a single, linear account. Instead he dropped shards, sharp, cutting fragments, that, when gathered, formed a mosaic too terrible to look at directly. It began, he hinted, with a gathering in the far cotton field near the old oak that locals called the Hanging Tree, though no rope had ever swung there in living memory. 12 souls were summoned after dusk. House workers, field hands, a young mother with an infant still at breast. Hargrave Sr. presided, flanked by 2 overseers whose names Caleb would later inscribe like accusations. What transpired was not punishment for theft or insolence. It was something colder, more deliberate, an act of erasure disguised as discipline. Caleb, working late in the main house, had seen only the prelude, the line of lanterns moving across the dark field like fallen stars. But in the weeks that followed he pieced together the aftermath from overheard whispers, from the sudden reassignment of labor gangs, from the way certain names vanished from roll calls and never returned. He wrote of fresh-turned earth near the smokehouse that no one was allowed to approach. He wrote of lime barrels disappearing from the shed. He wrote of Julian's face growing paler each day, of Clarissa's rocking chair falling silent for entire evenings. And he wrote, in one wrenching passage, "They think burial ends a thing. They think quicklime devours memory. But memory has bones. And bones remember." Fontaine's crew continued their work above, unaware at first of the growing gravity beneath their feet.
They pulled up more boards in the dining room, the library, the narrow hallway leading to the original kitchen.
In the spaces between floors they found additional relics, each one a silent scream preserved in time. A pair of child's shoes, soles worn to nothing, too small for any adult foot. A crudely carved wooden horse, one leg snapped clean as though broken in rage. A tin plate etched along the rim with the letter N, scratched so deeply the metal curled inward like a wound. Scraps of homespun cloth, some stained dark at the edges.
Fontaine collected them in a pine box in his room, arranging the objects like pieces of an incomplete reliquary.
Each night he sat with the journal, cross-referencing descriptions, searching for patterns. The more he read, the more the house itself seemed to lean in, listening. 11 days after the initial discovery, Fontaine composed a careful letter to Aldrich Vaughan, editor of the Natchez Courier, a man whose reputation for discretion matched his appetite for truth.
Fontaine described the journal without exaggeration, enclosed careful transcriptions of key passages, and asked 2 questions. Could Vaughan access Freedmen's Bureau records to verify workforce discrepancies from 1851? And did any Hargraves, or their kin, still walk the earth?
Vaughan's reply arrived within the week, terse and troubling.
Julian Hargrave was long dead.
But a nephew, Emmett Price, 34, resided in New Orleans and had twice visited Tensaw Parish in recent years, poring over family documents with what Vaughan delicately termed an interest bordering on obsession. Vaughan had not published a word. But he had inquired quietly. Elders in Natchez and St. Joseph remembered fragments, the unnatural quiet that settled over Hargrave Hall after the spring planting of 1851, laborers moved without explanation, certain faces that simply ceased to appear at Sunday meetings or Christmas gatherings. No one had dared speak the suspicion aloud. Yet the silence itself had weight. By the 4th week Fontaine no longer thought of himself as a contractor. He was an excavator of conscience. On a Sunday, when the crew rested and the bayou sang its eternal hymn of insects and water, he returned alone to Hargrave Hall. He carried Caleb's journal and a lantern. He crawled back into the narrow space beneath the parlor, then moved toward the rear of the house, toward the section Caleb had described with unnerving exactness. There, beneath what had once been the kitchen wing, the original floorboards were coated in a thick layer of agricultural lime, white and powdery, the kind used to sweeten fields or smother the stench of decay. Fontaine's lantern revealed footprints preserved in the dust, small, bare, hesitant, as though someone had paced there long ago, weighing whether to disturb the covering.
Caleb's entry from autumn 1852 burned in Fontaine's memory. He believes the lime will silence questions forever.
He does not understand that the lime is what first spoke to me. Only one reason a man spreads lime beneath his own roof.
And I knew them. Every name. I want someone to find this.
I want their names written where he cannot erase them.
Then came the list. 12 names. 1 per line.
Beside each, an age, a distinguishing mark, a single verb that read less like obituary and more like indictment.
Samuel, 41, scarred left cheek, witnessed.
Hannah, 29, carried child, sang.
Ezekiel, 17, fast runner, tried.
Fontaine read them aloud in a whisper, the names hanging in the stale air like incense. When he finished, he sat on the parlor floor above the lime, above the bones he now suspected lay beneath it, and felt the house settle around him, as though it, too, had been waiting for someone to speak the words.
The story was no longer about renovation. It was about resurrection.
Vaughan arrived 5 weeks later by ferry, leather satchel heavy with copied documents. Over chicory coffee in the boarding house dining room, he spread them across the scarred oak table.
Freedmen's Bureau labor rolls from 1865. A federal property inventory from 1864.
And in the margin of one page, in faded ink,
discrepancy in workforce 1851.
Approximate 12 souls unaccounted for in later enumerations.
No explanation from proprietor. Matter referred. Attachment C missing. 12. Vaughan met Fontaine's eyes.
The attachment is gone. Lost, destroyed, or never filed. But the notation remains. They sat in silence as Vaughan read the journal cover to cover. When he finished, his voice was raw.
This is real. Fontaine nodded. The lime. Vaughan exhaled. "We need an official. Someone outside the parish." I tried Duval. He looked at me like I was offering him poison. "He's local," Vaughn said quietly. "His people have been here since before secession. Whatever Harlan did, there are families here who helped or looked away. They prefer the floor stay nailed shut." That was the moment the investigation acquired its true adversary, not a single man, but an entire region's practiced amnesia. The South of 1887 had spent 2 decades polishing its scars into heritage. To unearth 12 names now was to tear open a wound the war had supposedly closed. And then there was Emmett Price. The next morning he arrived unannounced, alone, on horseback, dressed in crisp linen as though attending a garden party rather than a decaying plantation. Fontaine met him on the gallery. Price's smile was practiced, his eyes restless. "Thought I'd see how the work progresses," he said. Fontaine led the tour. When they reached the open parlor floor, Price gazed down into the gap without blinking. "How far does it run?" he asked. "Under most of the first story." Price nodded slowly. "Curious. Any notion why?" "Not yet." A lie, and both men knew it. Price's gaze lingered on the exposed original planks, on the faint white dust of lime still clinging in corners. Something flickered behind his calm calculation, perhaps, or recognition. "I'll mention it to my uncle," he said at last. "Could affect the valuation." Fontaine watched him right away, the hoofbeats fading into the humid morning. In his journal that night he wrote only one line. He already knows. The house waited. The line waited. The 12 names waited. And somewhere beneath the weight of silence, Caleb's vigil continued, patient, unyielding, certain that God's justice, though delayed, arrives with terrible clarity. Gerald Fontaine stood motionless on the wide gallery of Hargrave Hall as Emmett Price rode away. Dust rose in lazy spirals behind the horse, catching the late afternoon sun like motes of unsettled guilt. Price had smiled, polite, practiced, empty, and thanked him for the tour as though they had merely discussed roof shingles and paint. But Fontaine had watched the man's eyes. They had lingered too long on the open gap in the parlor floor, on the white dust of lime still clinging to the edges like frost on a grave. When the road curved behind the live oaks and Price vanished, Fontaine felt the house exhale behind him, a long, weary sigh carried on the humid wind. That evening he found Aldrich Vaughn at the boarding house, seated at a corner table beneath a slow-turning ceiling fan that did little but stir the thick air. Vaughn listened without interruption as Fontaine recounted the visit. When the account ended, Vaughn set his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "He already knew about the false floor," Fontaine said. "He came to see if we'd found what lies beneath it." Vaughn nodded once. "And now he knows you have." They argued deep into the night. Vaughn, the newspaperman, burned to print something, anything, to force the evidence into daylight before it could vanish again. A public record, he insisted. Even a fragment. Enough to make disappearance harder. Fontaine shook his head. "We don't have the full story yet. Caleb's journal circles the truth but never lands on it squarely. The entries stop in the winter of 1853. Blank pages at the end, like he meant to finish and never could." He tapped the small leather book on the table between them. "The 12 names are there. The lime is there. But without a plain, unbroken account, this can be explained away. Dismissed as the bitter fancy of a man the law didn't even recognize as human." Vaughn leaned forward. "Then we keep looking." For days later, Fontaine found what he had prayed for in the dim sacristy of St. Joseph Catholic Church. The parish register was a heavy volume bound in cracked calfskin, its pages yellowed and foxed, smelling faintly of old incense and candle wax. The priest on duty, Father Leblanc, a young man with kind eyes and a nervous habit of touching his collar, allowed Fontaine to examine the older volumes under supervision. Fontaine turned pages until he reached June 12, 1851. A single baptismal entry. Child, Thomas. No surname. Plantation of origin, Hargrave. Godparents, 2 names from the household staff, routine. But in the margin, in a different hand, cramped, urgent, almost trembling, Father Dominique Broussard had written.
This child was brought to me at night by a woman who said she feared for his life.
She would not say why.
I baptized him as she begged.
God forgive me. I asked no further questions. I should have asked more. June 1851. Fontaine read the words twice, 3 times.
The ink had browned with age, but the gilt remained fresh. Broussard had served the parish from 1843 until his death in 1869.
No other Hargrave-related entries bore his marginal notes. Only this one. A secret baptism performed in haste.
A mother's terror so great she risked exposure under cover of darkness. A priest's confession, hidden in the margin of an official record, that he had failed his duty. Fontaine carried the register back to Vaughan like a man carrying live coals. He placed it beside Caleb's journal and the Freedman's Bureau notation on the scarred oak table.
"Is this enough?" he asked.
Vaughan studied the 3 documents for a long minute.
"In any other place, maybe. In 1887 Louisiana? I don't know if anything will ever be enough." "Then what do we do?"
"We preserve it," Vaughan said quietly.
"We make certain none of it disappears.
Then we decide who sees it." But the decision was taken out of their hands. 4 days after the church discovery, a letter arrived at Alton Price's Memphis office from his nephew Emmett. The message was polite, businesslike, urgent: halt all renovation immediately. Emmett claimed new concerns about the structural integrity of the foundations. Continuing without expert reassessment risked irreparable harm to the property. Fontaine read the letter when Alton forwarded it, agitation plain in the older man's scrawl.
"Pretext," Fontaine said flatly. "No one has questioned the foundations.
The only thing that's changed is that we've marked the limed section. He's afraid of what we'll find if we keep going." Alton Price, pragmatic, detached, uninterested in ancestral ghosts, replied with a single sentence: the work would continue on schedule. If Emmett had legitimate concerns, he could bring them to the contractor directly.
Emmett did not return in person.
But the pressure mounted in subtler ways. A stranger lingered too long outside the boarding house, reading the same newspaper for hours. Conversations in the general store hushed when Fontaine entered. At night, the creak of floorboards in the hallway outside his room seemed too deliberate, too careful. Fontaine began sleeping with Caleb's journal beneath his pillow and the pine box of artifacts locked in his trunk.
Then Tuscan made the discovery that changed everything.
In the final week of exposing the interfloor space, Tuscan, whose hands knew with the way a blind man knows Braille, crawled along the limed section near the old kitchen wing. His lantern caught a hairline seam in the original floorboards, a near-perfect rectangle, 4 feet by 6, cut so cleanly it could only have been the work of a skilled carpenter. The lime had filled and hardened the cut decades ago, dust and time had camouflaged the rest.
But Tuscan's fingertips traced the outline and knew. A hatch. Beneath the original floor. Beneath the basement level.
A third, hidden void.
Fontaine arrived within the hour. He knelt
beside the seam, pressed gently. The panel gave the faintest sigh of trapped air, sealed, preserved, waiting.
"Do we open it?" Tuscan asked.
In the lamplight their shadows stretched long across the ancient planks. The smell of lime was sharp here, almost alive.
"Yes," Fontaine said.
They worked with reverence and caution. Chisels eased away hardened lime, pry bars lifted gently. After 40 minutes the hatch came free with a low groan, releasing a puff of stale, chemical-scented air that made both men cough. Below lay a brick-lined cavity, 3 feet deep, perhaps 5 feet square. Inside, wrapped first in oilcloth, then in layers of waxed canvas, a bundle of papers.
Fontaine carried them to the boarding house.
That night, beneath the hiss of the kerosene lamp, he unwrapped Harlan Hargrave Sr.'s private records.
Not the public ledgers shown to creditors or taxmen.
These were personal, Hargrave's own hand, his private cipher, his secret accounts stretching back to the early 1840s.
Purchases. Transfers. Correspondence coded just enough to obscure meaning from prying eyes. And then, bound separately with twine, the documents from spring 1851.
Fontaine read for 3 unbroken hours, cross-referencing with Caleb's journal.
Dates aligned. Names matched.
The fragments Caleb had gathered in terror and darkness coalesced into a complete, monstrous whole. Hargrave Hall had never been merely a cotton plantation.
Its position isolated, screened by trees, backed by bayous that fed into the Mississippi, made it ideal for something far darker.
For at least 5 years before 1851, Hargrave had operated as a clandestine way station in the domestic slave trade. Not a public auction yard, but a quiet transit point, people brought in by flatboat under cover of night, held in outbuildings, sorted, redocumented with false origins, and shipped onward to the Deep South's larger markets.
The legitimate cotton operation provided perfect cover: wagons, workers, traffic that raised no suspicion.
The entries were meticulous, cold, commercial. Dollar amounts beside coded initials. Cargo of 8 received April 14, 1849 via river, dispatched April 22 to Natchez buyer. Profits noted in the margins like harvest tallies.
Then came spring 1851. Something broke.
12 individuals, men, women, a nursing mother among them, died under conditions Hargrave himself had created. The documents did not flinch from the cause: overcrowding in a holding pen during an unseasonable flood, inadequate water, disease spreading unchecked. Hargrave had known the risks.
He had chosen profit over mitigation.
When the deaths occurred, he did not report them.
He did not bury them in the slave cemetery with markers.
He covered the bodies with quicklime in a pit near the smokehouse, then, when questions began to stir among the quarters, decided the pit itself was too exposed.
So he brought the evidence inside.
The hatch had been cut by a carpenter from Natchez, paid in cash and sworn to silence.
The bodies, or what remained after lime, were placed in the cavity. The hatch sealed.
Lime spread across the surrounding floor to kill the smell and the questions.
Then, months later, the false floor laid above it all.
Hargrave lived in the house for another 12 years, ate his meals above the cavity, slept above the silence he had purchased.
Fontaine closed the last page. His hands shook.
Beside him, Vaughan's face was ashen.
Caleb had known.
Trusted in the house, he had overheard enough to reconstruct the outline. When the reassignments began, anyone who might have seen too much sent elsewhere, Caleb refused dispersal. He vanished into the structure itself, becoming the one witness Hargrave could never silence. The journal's final entry, dated to the first hard frost of 1853, was brief and toneless: the helper had not come for several weeks.
Caleb did not know why.
There was no farewell, no final testament.
Only blank pages.
Had he starved in the dark?
Had illness taken him?
Or, Vaughan's preferred theory, had he slipped away one night when the house slept, carrying nothing but the knowledge he had already committed to paper? No remains had been found in the interfloor space.
But the area was vast. Lime could reduce flesh to dust over decades. The truth, Fontaine realized, might never be certain.
What was certain? 12 names now had faces in memory.
A mother's midnight baptism carried new weight.
A priest's marginal guilt echoed down the years. And the river, always the river, had borne witness to the traffic of souls, silent and ceaseless.
Fontaine looked at Vaughan across the table.
"We can't let this disappear," he said.
Vaughan nodded slowly.
"Then we don't stop."
Outside, the bayou murmured. The house waited.
And somewhere in its bones, the vigil Caleb began continued patient, unblinking, certain that what is buried in darkness must one day rise into the merciless light of truth. The question of what became of Kato after the winter of 1853 haunted Gerald Fontaine like a half-heard prayer. The journal ended without ceremony: no final testament, no farewell. Only blank pages staring back like empty pews in an abandoned chapel. Had starvation claimed him in the suffocating dark? Had lime reduced what remained to dust indistinguishable from the soil beneath? Or had the chaos of war, the same war that shattered Harlan Hargrave's empire, finally cracked open a door long sealed? Fontaine and Aldrich Vaughan debated the possibilities in hushed voices over cooling coffee. Vaughan favored escape. The Union occupation in '63 turned the parish upside down. Troops in the house, Julian fled to Shreveport, supply lines broken. A helper who had risked everything for 12 years might have seen the moment and seized it.
Fontaine was less certain. No record of a free Kato in the Freedmen's Bureau files. No trace in New Orleans censuses. Men like him vanished without ripple. The journal survived because he made it separate from his own life. He understood, his body might fail, but the truth he carried did not have to. In early summer 1887, Vaughan made the choice that would test their fragile alliance. He would publish, not in the Natchez Courier, where the story would be dismissed as local gossip, but in a New York weekly with a national reach and a reputation for unflinching accounts of the South's lingering wounds. He sent no originals, only meticulous summaries, verbatim excerpts from the journal, transcriptions of Harlan's Hatch documents, the church marginalia, the freedman's notation, and his own carefully sourced reconstruction. The piece appeared in late July under the headline, "Buried Testimony, a Hidden Floor Reveals a Plantation's Unspoken Crimes." Tensaw Parish answered with silence, not the stunned hush of disbelief, but the deliberate, collective muteness of a community that had long practiced forgetting. No local paper reprinted it. Sheriff Duval offered no comment. Alton Price, when queried by mail, replied curtly that renovations were complete and relevant materials had been surrendered to authorities, a claim so transparently false that Fontaine laughed bitterly when he read it. Emmett Price's response arrived 3 weeks later, a polished letter to the editor, measured in tone, lethal in precision. He questioned the journal's authenticity, suggested Fontaine lacked credentials to interpret historical artifacts, and described the so-called hidden floor as a mundane architectural quirk, a raised subfloor common in damp climates. He made no reference to the hatch. No mention of the private papers sealed within. Whether ignorance or calculated omission, the silence around those documents spoke louder than any denial. The story flickered briefly in abolitionist circles and historical societies before fading. 1887 America had wearied of its own past. Reconciliation had become the national creed. The North would cease probing Southern sins if the South would cease resisting federal order. The article was read, noted, filed away. No investigation followed. No grand jury convened. Fontaine retained custody of the artifacts through 1887 and into 1888, the journal, the Hatch documents, the small relics from between the floors. He wrote to universities, historical societies, the emerging Library of Congress Division collecting slavery-era records. Responses were polite, slow, cautious. Political winds still favored amnesia. Then, in late September 1888, a letter arrived at Fontaine's St. Joseph office. No return address. Handwriting precise, deliberate, the careful script of someone who had fought for every letter learned in secret. The message was brief. I read what was written in the newspaper. I have waited many years for someone to find what lay under that floor. I remain in Louisiana. I am old now. If you wish to know what became of the others, I will tell you what I know. Come to New Orleans. Ask for Claudette at the French Market Riverside on Tuesday morning. She will know where to find me. 12 initials followed, arranged in 2 neat columns of 6. No signature. Fontaine traveled south the following Tuesday. The French market smelled of river mud, roasted coffee, and overripe figs. Claudette, 60ish, eyes weary but sharp, studied him when he gave his name, then closed her stall without a word. She led him through narrow streets of peeling stucco and iron balconies to a modest boarding house on the edge of the Creole district. She knocked twice, spoke low French through the door. It opened. The man who stood there was ancient, 70, perhaps more. Thin as a winter reed, dressed with meticulous care, clean linen shirt, pressed trousers, hands folded like a man accustomed to long patience. His eyes held the steady clarity of someone who had outlived fear. Mr. Fontaine. Yes. I am sorry. I do not know your name. You wouldn't. A small pause. My name is Kato. Come in. Over 2 days in a small, high-ceilinged room lit by a single window overlooking a courtyard jasmine vine, Kato spoke. Fontaine wrote without pause, pages filling with the same reverence he had once reserved for blueprints and load-bearing calculations. This was not testimony extracted under duress. This was confession offered freely. After decades of deliberate silence, Kato confirmed every fragment the evidence had suggested and filled the human spaces documents could never touch.
He named the 12 again, slowly, giving each name time to settle: Henry, Dora, Sam, Louisa, Remy, Pearl, Walter, June, and Moses, Ada, Tom, Bess. No surnames, because the law had denied them any. He described the clandestine transit operation: flatboats slipping in under moonless skies, frightened people held in outbuildings, papers forged to erase origins, profits tallied in Harlan's private ledger. Spring 1851, a transit gone catastrophically wrong. Overcrowded holding pens during a flood season. Disease racing through like fire in dry grass. Harlan's response: not aid, but erasure. Quicklime over bodies in a pit, then when whispers grew, the bodies moved beneath the house itself. The hatch cut, the false floor laid, the smell smothered, the questions buried. Kato spoke of the woman who had carried her infant son to Father Broussard in the dead of night. She feared they would take him next. She never returned to the quarters. Harlan sent her away, sold south, I heard. I never learned her name after that. He spoke of the years beneath the floor without self-pity. At first the darkness pressed like a hand over my mouth. I thought madness would come. But I had the names. I had the journal. As long as I wrote, the truth breathed somewhere in the world, even if no one ever read it. How did you leave? Fontaine asked. Cato's first smile in 2 days: small, wry. The war. In 1863, the house filled with blue coats. Julian gone. The helper, her name I still guard, her children live, came one night. The house is empty. It is time. 12 years under those boards. I stepped out into moonlight and chaos. Made my way to New Orleans. Lived through occupation, through reconstruction, through the slow return of old shadows. I waited. You left the journal deliberately. I knew floors rot. Someone would lift them eventually. The question was whether they would see what lay beneath or merely repair and move on. And if they hadn't understood? Kato considered it calmly. Then I would have kept waiting. I became very good at waiting, Mr. Fontaine. Fontaine left New Orleans on Thursday, journal heavy with fresh pages. He never saw Kato again. A follow-up letter the next spring returned unopened, marked only, "He is gone." Claudette answered no further correspondence. In 1891, Fontaine donated the journal, hatch documents, relics, and his own work journals to a Washington archive. They were catalogued under Plantation Records, Louisiana, Tensaw Parish, 1840s-1860s, and largely forgotten. Hargrave Hall was raised in 1901. Cypress beams salvaged for new construction. Brick from the foundation and the hatch repurposed for an outbuilding. The original floor, where lime had been spread in 12 names inscribed in darkness, fed a bonfire. Emmett Price died in 1919, age 66. His obituary praised his devotion to preserving antebellum legacy. No mention of Hargrave Hall. Aldrich Vaughan retired in 1903, died in 1907. Among his papers, a folder labeled simply Hargrave. Inside, correspondence, notes, and one photograph, an itinerant print from autumn 1888. An old man seated outdoors, thin, neatly dressed, hands folded. He gazes off frame. On the reverse, in Vaughan's hand, 2 words. He waited. Gerald Fontaine worked on until 1907. In his final years, colleagues noticed him pause sometimes, staring at any floor, house, church, warehouse, with a quiet, unreadable intensity. Not fear. Not suspicion. Simply the knowledge, carried in the bones, that surfaces can conceal. That the space between one level and the next may hold the truest story of a place. He died in 1912. His journals joined a local historical society, rarely opened. The 12 names: Henry, Dora, Sam, Louisa, Remy, Pearl, Walter, June, and Moses, Ada, Tom, Bess exist now only in that small leather book, in the archive records, in the memory of 2 men who listened when the past finally spoke. No court ever heard their case. No memorial bears their names. No official marker acknowledges their lives or their ends. Yet they are in the record. They have been since the night Fontaine first opened the journal and read. My name is Kato. I belong to Harlan Hargrave and I have been in this house for 3 years without anyone knowing I am here.
And they will remain.
Because some floors are lifted. Some truths rise. And some waiting, patient, deliberate, unbreakable, finally ends in light.